Hi, I'm Alan Miller, and this is the Together Talks podcast, and it's really fantastic to be joined today by Laura Dodsworth. Hello, Laura.
Hello, thank you.
Laura, as many of you will know, is an author and a photographer, documentary filmmaker, and is the author of A State of Fear. And A State of Fear, I don't think it would be too much to say, really managed to get into the public realm and the public arena a recognition of the role of what is called nudge, but the role of the behavioural insights team and SPI-B, SPI-B, which is a weird acronym. It sounds like a spy thing, which actually is not that far from the truth. But where lots of psychiatrists and psychologists were working out how to implement measures using our brains and engaging with us. And Laura, A State of Fear, when you brought it out, I think has had a massive impact on the discussion and just on the recognition of what was done. Just what led up, just tell me a bit about what led up. What made you decide to do this? I know you've talked about it a bit before, but just why did you decide to do this? What gave you the inspiration?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost hard looking back now because it feels like forever ago, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Pre-COVID it just feels like another era. You know, when people talk about going back to old normal, although no one talks about that anymore because it's like we're sort of there. I've always thought there is no old normal, it doesn't exist anymore. And in fact, I don't want it. And the reason I don't want old normal is because it was whipped away so easily. So for me, the origin of the book is the fear that I thought was palpable in the air when the lockdown started. I mean, there was some fear before, but, you know, that very strong address to the nation that Boris Johnson gave on the 23rd of March is one of those moments that I think you'll always remember where you were. I was sitting on the sofa at home with my boyfriend at the time. My kids were in the house. And there was this feeling of, oh, what do we do? Do we have to go back to our own houses now? Does it start now? Can we wait till tomorrow? What will it be like out there tomorrow? How will this be policed? You know, there's a lot of uncertainty about it. Is it that bad? What's going to happen? My kids like to tease me now that I made them wash their hands when they'd come into the house for the first couple of weeks. Because if you remember then, there was, it was thought that it was spreading through fomite transmission, through touching things. I feel it was a fairly sensible precaution asking my dirty boys to wash their hands when they came in the house, but they like to tease me now that I got a bit wrapped up in it. I also remember stocking up on tinned goods. Sorry, when you asked me this, you probably weren't thinking about my shopping list, but I remember thinking, you know, if I get COVID, how will the boys feed themselves? Because we're not supposed to do the things we normally do, which is go out and ask family and friends. Oh, I'll be isolated. What if I can't get out of bed? And so I remember that feeling of fear about the virus. But I just remember feeling stunned and alarmed that we were going to shut society down because we've never done this before globally, you know, not in the history of the world. This was a completely new thing. Now, I only did economics up to A-level, so you can make of this what you will. But I instantly thought, oh, crikey, you know, this is going to interrupt supply chains and manufacture and people aren't going to be working. What's going to happen to the economy? Oh, this could easily lead to high inflation. I mean, really, when politicians and people who work at the Bank of England and economists are saying the high inflation now is unforeseeable. I don't know what planet they were on. So there were all these different sorts of fears. People had fear of infection. They had fear for the economy. They had fear for their own jobs. You know, I'm a freelancer. My work stopped overnight. I remember talking to a newspaper who said they couldn't commission me to do something because they couldn't be seen to create any expenses or send somebody out into the world. People had fears in a very short space of time for their minds, you know, for being stuck in the house, for that what was going to do to their mental health. The fear was just in the air. And it always struck me that the enduring story will be how this happened. Because infections will come and go, plagues come and go, pandemics come and go. But our psychology is here to stay. And it was obvious quite early that some of the fears were being exaggerated. And people drive themselves mad, sometimes wondering why. But there is, you know, people think, are there conspiracy theories coming to plan? Or is it a big cock up? But there's a very simple answer to why fears were leveraged. And that's because it was to make people follow the rules. Again, the why behind that is something else, but you will drive yourself crazy trying to figure it out. The fact is that people were scared into submission. We know that there was a plan to do that from those Spy B minutes dated also the 23rd of March, or possibly the 22nd. See, it's so long ago, I don't remember the exact day of that seminal set of minutes, that said that people's sense of personal threat had to be exaggerated because people, and this is key, people understood the risk to their demographic group. So somebody like me, who's the right side of 50, low BMI, healthy, no clinical comorbidities, I understood very quickly that COVID wasn't likely to be a huge threat to me. So the advisors on Spy B will have told the government in answer to a question about how to encourage adherence, one of the things you can do is frighten them into compliance, raise the sense of threat and risk. And I expect things like this have always happened, but to see it in black and white seemed truly astonishing, a watershed moment. It's a real plot twist in the story that it's out there in the open. And so for me, that's what I gravitated to. I think I've always been interested in those taboo areas.
Well, I mean, you do. And you've got the quote at the start of the book. It says, the perceived level of personal threat needs to be increased among those who are complacent using hard-hitting emotional messaging. So a very direct, explicit call to arms, effectively, of what needed to be done in March by Spy B. And in fact, looking through your book again, I mean, I read it at the time, and I mean, one of the things is that if you had been following politics for a while, people would know about the nudge unit. They would have known about nudge, right? They would have known about what happened with Obama. People knew about Schiphol Airport and all the different things that.
No, Alan, lots of people don't know about nudge.
Right. That's what I'm saying. The people who might have been following it would have known about it, but many did not. And and what you did with this book is I think, popularized that. You made it become apparent to MPs as well as the public and many people. I mean, a lot of people that have been train spotting, looking at what's happened with the COVID response, I think some people think that everyone's part of something, right? Some plan or something, as though all the MPs are involved. But actually, many didn't even know about the nudge unit, right? Or the behavioural insights team. But when I went back to read through there, it's just so shocking, some of this, when you see it in black and white again, and what we all went through, and the fact that it was really very explicit that people were not scared enough and we need to frighten them more. What do you think that fear actually does? When you talked about the consequences for psychology and our way of understanding things, what do you think the consequence of creating a situation, a state of play or a state of fear, as this pandemic and lockdowns are finished and everything, but where does that leave us? What are the consequences of that?
Oh my goodness, there are so many ways to answer this question. Let me try and do some bullet points now so you can help me remember and come back to them all. We're going to have to talk about the impact on mental and physical health, the impact on democracy, the ethics, but also why fear. Let's start with the why. Well, emotion is the engine that drives our behaviour. And fear is the steam in the engine. It's very powerful. It creates a sense of urgency. I mean, one thing that's dangerous specifically about using fear, especially in campaigns such as these, is people weren't really being given action. They were just being told to stay at home. So that leaves you feeling frightened and disempowered. I mean, if you frighten somebody and at least give them something concrete to do, then they can feel like they're going to alleviate that fear that's being created. But people were just told to stay at home. So that created these cauldrons of fear. And then, of course, while they're at home, the media coverage was 24/7 on COVID. There's one chap in my book called Darren who describes what a robust individual he was. He said more of it to me than's in the book. He'd been a police officer all of his life. He's knocked down front doors. He's done riot policing. He's a tough guy. But he had cancer and he had some other clinical comorbidities. And so he knew he was at risk. He already knew he was at risk. And then he starts getting the texts and the letters from the NHS. Now, I'm not criticising the texts and the letters. He's exactly who we should have been protecting in the pandemic. But it created this feeling of alarm. Then when he's shielding, and something on the shielding, which is funny, just as a little aside, the advice was that he and his wife should use separate kitchens and bathrooms. The people that designed this advice are on a completely other planet. So for that means his wife had to shield with him because they don't have another bathroom or kitchen. They're going to be sharing everything. So they're both holed up there together. Maybe that was good. But while they're stuck at home, what are they doing? Well, they're gorging on media, which was doom-laden. And so, there's programs about how to wash your shopping and put it into quarantine when it comes in. It just didn't stop. Yeah. And he describes it as boom, boom, boom. That's what he said. It was a barrage. So for him, his fears went through the roof. Now, I actually spoke to him recently regarding another book I'm writing. I wanted to see where he is, how he's doing. And he's not frightened anymore. And actually, he feels really angry about how much his fears were escalated. He says it was just too much. And he thinks in any other line of work, the people that did that would have been arrested by now. But of course, we're talking about the NHS and the government. There's no arrests for scaring him witless. But he feels that there was too much misinformation, too much reliance on fear. And he's angry. And now is a lot more mistrustful about information. So what the fear does is exaggerate concerns. That affects mental health, psychological health. There's a new condition that's been described called COVID anxiety syndrome by a team of psychologists. They coined the term because they found that some people were left with excessive hygiene habits and OCDs even after their threats to themselves had receded. And actually in this country, we had the highest levels of fear and COVID anxiety syndrome in the countries that they surveyed. Not surprised, because I bet you could correlate this to the types of media messaging and the amount spent as well. Okay, so there's the impact on health. It also makes recovery harder then, because if you exaggerate people's fears, how do you then get them to the stage where they can feel like it's safe to go out, safe to let go of the masks? We see it now. I think people are really hyper alert. They've been red pilled. They're waiting for the next disasters. Look at how the media's leapt upon things like monkeypox. Everyone's just ready to be scared again. We're in this hyper vigilant state, which is not healthy to be in, and it's not good for recovery, for society, for the economy, people's mental health. How else does fear affect us? Well, we've found out that our leaders will use fear to control our behaviour, to manipulate us. Now, if we give it the best possible interpretation, and I think this is realistic, that they did it in our best interests. We were psychologically kettled into staying indoors because that was best for us, they thought. When did we, as a nation, ever consent to these sorts of tactics being used? I haven't. Now, if this was a laboratory experiment, if a psychologist was doing a test to see how fear affects us, we would sign a consent form to go into that scenario. And we also wouldn't be allowed to leave the laboratory till we were okay. We're still not okay. Lots of people are still not okay, and we never consented. And I find this a very unpalatable relationship with government. I want government to fix the potholes, look after the borders. I want the government to stay well away from my emotions. It's none of the government's business. And I think that even if they had our best interests at heart, what they've done is create more problems rather than having utilised a more fact-based, rational and accurate public information campaign. Finally, I think it's finally in my list of bullet points. I think it's undemocratic to use behavioural science, including fear as a tool, because there are others. There are other sorts of biases that were exploited, like social conformity, norming, we all want to be in a group, or shaming the outliers. I mean, the way that people who didn't want to get vaccinated were treated was shocking. I think we swerved something potentially truly terrible there. So there are lots of egregious methods. Fear is just one of them. But what they do is change your behaviour by affecting you subliminally below the level of your rational consciousness. And once a government's doing that, what else might you be led to change your ways in a way that goes beyond their mandate? I mean, I think politicians should have a really good idea, convince you it's a good idea, get you to vote for them, and then enact it. I don't think they should be voted in and then try sneaky psychological methods to get you to agree for ideas you didn't vote for. Now, I know a pandemic is an exceptional example, but actually we can see a lot of the same methods being applied now to the very controversial policies that are needed to see through net zero. So,
I mean, you could say that there's there have been examples in the past historically where fear's been used and for hearts and minds in different ways, but maybe with a combination of other things like patriotism and the idea of interest. So like around war, for instance, is what's most striking, where perhaps that's sometimes used. And some people would argue this was as serious as that. But your point about how it treats the demos or the people or the citizens, and why do you think it is that elected leaders did not think it was the right way to go about presenting all the evidence as they had it, as they saw it? We kept hearing about the science, but the evidence as we knew it, who was at risk, what could be done. What do you think was preventing a sense of let's put it to the people, present all the things we know? Because initially, rather than getting locked up, we had 1 million people volunteer for things. We saw there was a real sense of we'll come and help and can do. And there were some changes by the government, weren't they? They kind of did a U-turn from their original position. But that bit about their orientation to the people, why do you think there was a lack of willingness to do that?
Well, my own cynical interpretation is that a lot of these things often have an illusory quality. Asking people to volunteer with the NHS, they were probably never going to be utilised. It's a bit like people giving homes to Ukrainians. A lot of fanfare about this scheme. There's lots of advantages and disadvantages with that. That's not going to that. But it's to make it look like they're actually doing something. Clearly, a small number of people operating up their homes in this country does nothing for the refugee crisis en masse, does it? It's like the government petitions website. If you look at the petitions that have been listed on the site, and then what happens as a result, you'll see very little true change that comes as a result of petitions. It makes people feel like they've bought into something democratic. I just feel that there's an illusory quality to those things. I think, the government did U-turn, and for me that couple of weeks is the really interesting point in history, and being a fly on the wall and understanding more about what made the pivot would be interesting. Funny enough, it was the director of the Nudge Unit, Professor Dr. David Halpern. He's one of the heads of the Behavioural Insights team. He just inadvertently referred to herd immunity on a BBC News programme. He had no idea what he was going to stir up there. Nobody liked the term herd immunity. I suppose it conjures up feelings of animals being willingly slaughtered, or just reduces us to a status of being animals. It kind of objectifies people, probably made them feel threatened. And the media didn't like it at all. So I think the media is one of the drivers for the government U-turn. The problem is that when people completely gave up on the idea of herd immunity, which is where you're going to end up through natural infections and through vaccinations anyway, what they did was offer them up on an altar of herd psychology, because then it involved treating people like a big herd to be corralled inside their houses to control infections and community transmission.
When you go through it, we've had like £500 million or more spent in advertising on campaigns, and a constant, as you would say, like barrage in the media and elsewhere with fear. I'm interested in this idea of not engaging the public and hearts and minds, but we also saw a number of things, didn't we? We saw that there was a lack of parliamentary scrutiny. There wasn't really a kind of open weighing up of costs and benefits of things. I mean, as you say, lockdowns were very, very new. How did it suddenly, well, in your opinion, why did it come about that years of pandemic preparedness just got jettisoned and this new thing got implemented? I mean, what from I know this was about nudge and fear and everything, but what do you think led to that? Why do you think that was such a break with what had happened before?
Well, I can give a few answers, but it's important for me to say that I don't think I'm the Delphic Oracle. I don't have the final answer, and that's also not what a state of fear is about. A state of fear is about how, and it's not about why.
Yeah.
If the pandemic was like a house on fire, okay, there are still some little flames. And it's not until the ashes are cooled that people are going to be able to go in and really understand the why. So I don't think I've got the answers. I strongly suspect that politicians were caught in the headlamps themselves and they were subject to their own fears. Fears about the virus, but also fears about their political careers, and fears about the inquiry, which is going to dog them for years to come, and fears about how they were being treated in the media. So they probably had to capitulate to a narrative that was growing about taking action and following other countries. That's another big thing. We followed Italy and China. Countries were falling like dominoes in this. So I think fear is part of it. I'm sure it will be very multifactorial and there will be lots of different answers that feed into this. I don't buy into the idea there's one simple answer for why we U-turned. And I think it will take a long time to get to the bottom of it. But the lack of parliamentary scrutiny is really important because even though we were in emergency, we could have taken a few days or a few weeks for Parliament and lawyers to scrutinise the legislation better. It was a hot, sticky mess. And I don't know how many statutory instruments were applied over it over the months, but hundreds.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the things is when perhaps even more when there's moments, it's why you train in the military and other examples of your skydiving or parachuting or whatever, so that in those moments, or when you're a pilot, in those moments when there are a problem that happens, you're prepared and ready for it and you can make decisions quickly under pressure. And that's why you need procedures in place,
yes.
right? And the ability to weigh up risks and costs and benefits and assess them and evaluate them and be clear about those things. It does strike me that much of that approach has been waning in the run up to COVID. You know, the whole kind of open discussions about what's best for everyone, how we engage with them, how we make those decisions. So we almost saw a bit of a perfect storm happen, right? Where a number of different things happen. On the one hand, the public treating with quite a lot of contempt, right? It's like, this is how we're going to do it. This is what you do. Go and do that. And when in doubt, regulate. Silencing and people being sort of not allowed to say certain things and taken down. A combination of all of those things were seemed to be put en masse. And within it, the central part of it was always this driving fear, and accusatory, right? If you don't go along with this, what you're actually being responsible for is potential huge deaths. That was another part of it, wasn't it? It wasn't just the fear to yourself or to others. It was like you could be the contributor to many deaths in Britain.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of responsibility heaped on people. And that was also the approach to people who didn't want to be vaccinated or who stood against the COVID pass for, various reasons, that it was irresponsible, that you could cause people to get ill and die. It's pretty hard to argue way out of that one with that, because the people using those arguments appear to have the moral high ground. And it also makes conversation with them difficult if they believe they have the moral high ground.
I mean, in your book, and I'm sure many other people, you've got a lot of, as well as your diligent research and interviews with various protagonists, you also speak to, as you've just given an example, ordinary people and how this played out. How much do you think, this is impressionistic, but in terms of the public and having a recognition of what's happened in the last couple of years, and this speaks to a question about any inquiry or anything, but how much do you think that people have understood what's just happened generally in Britain?
I don't know. I think that is impossible I don't think I can have any accurate litmus test on that. I'm really sceptical about the use of research to get to the heart of these matters. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. But also the people I know within a certain social circle, they might be more likely to think like me. I encounter a complete mix of opinions in real life. I don't know if there's a majority opinion one way or the other. I really don't know. I think you've got to be really careful about applying your own biases and relying on your own network for that. But I wanted to include those personal stories in the book because if you remember, there were lots of stories about people who were on their feet and exhausted in hospital running A&E wards, or people who were ill in hospital who had not got vaccinated, and they're the kind of, the cautionary tale. There were lots and lots of personal stories throughout the pandemic, but all from one side and never from the other. And I really wanted to include testimony from people who were quite undone by their fear and show what happened to them. So from teenagers who maybe developed OCDs and agoraphobia to Darren, who I mentioned, to a woman who found her son after a suicide attempt, to a paramedic actually who kept going out to suicide attempts, to show what the impact was on ordinary people that we just weren't seeing in the media at all. Everything was painted as being very cheery. Do you remember? I mean, this is going back now, but when it all started, everything was so cheerful in the media. How to make bread and how to educate your children in the garden and how to whip up a gatto from 20-year-old Borlotti beans in the back of the cupboard. You know, it was incessant. And I actually felt quite dark at the time, and none of that related to me. I didn't get it. It didn't resonate. I didn't feel like I was in this amazing crafting time. I didn't feel like I was going to go and learn a new language and learn how to make bread, and didn't really want to forest school my children. But that was the cadence of the media at the time.
And it sort of speaks to the question of how the experience of the last couple of years was very different for very different people, and the impression of the media and who they think they're talking to, because you have to have a nice big garden and you have to, you know, and the whole bread baking moment, the whole trajectory, there's a very particular outlook, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh my God, I've just got to give one example. So the first Christmas, there was a suggestion, I can't remember if the Professors on Sage or Indie Sage, one of the two. The suggestion was that people could have a Christmas tree in their front garden so that a family could come around and exchange presents in the front garden. I was like, mate, do you know that not everyone has a front garden? And not everyone can afford big Christmas trees. And it was almost like this kind of idyllic vision of twinkly-eyed foxes in the corner of the garden and fairy lights bedecked in, you know, on the front lawn. That's not how life looks for a lot of people. A lot of people in flats don't have a garden. A lot of people in houses don't have a garden. Totally out of touch.
Yeah, and it did demonstrate a division as well by some people who enjoyed the period, who were perhaps paid and they could work remotely and they might have a nice balcony or some good garden, and their experiences of a very particular journey in some way if you were kind of professional and in that category. Whereas if you had a couple of kids and on your own or not on your own and you were in a flat somewhere without any of those amenities, and it became quite shrill and cruel, didn't it? Like if you were going out to the park and some people were saying you've been out more than once to the park to go outside, or people being moved away for sitting down on the park, and this kind of almost like antagonism between fellow citizens around this concern and fear of us as being kind of potentially infectors and vectors, that sense that we weren't all in it together, that some people enjoyed some of the things more. There was a very different experience, and also some people were evil almost if they didn't go along with it.
Yeah, you can see how Eastern European community bloc policing happens really easily. One of the ways that the social credit system is applied in China is that people can get credits by reporting on their neighbours who gossip. It's lovely, isn't it? And gossiping is something which can lose you social credits. So I do think there was actually naturally a very organic community response when the pandemic first started. So people offering to do shopping for neighbours and, you know, you saw nice signs on community notice boards when you're allowed out. And I think actually that the heavy-handed government interference, and especially things like the emergence of snitch lines, really killed that. And you mentioned parks. I mean, that was particularly horrible when parks shut in cities, because for some people, especially people with kids, that's all they wanted to do in the summer. I interviewed one woman who lives in a room with her son, and I didn't actually know that people even live like this in modern Britain. It was eye-opening for me. She lived in a room that had no windows and ventilation, which is illegal, but that doesn't mean people aren't living like that in council provided accommodation. That's how she lives. Smelt of damp. It would not have been good for their lungs being in there. And they had, you know, infestations. Okay. And she said to me, I pray we're let out soon because it gets hot in this room in summer. Now, for her, English is her second language as well. So to be able to get past what was effectively propaganda and understand the true risks to her as a young, healthy woman and her little boy, and I'm going to assume they didn't have any clinical conditions, to get through that, and it's not even in her first language, is a really big ask. So she didn't even want to take her son to the park because she thought they might catch COVID if he went on the slide or something. So, yeah, people had very different experiences of lockdown. And for the people who got something from it, who changed their lifestyles, well, that is something good to take from it. But you don't have to have a government-enforced lockdown to make lifestyle changes.
Thinking about where we are now, and you've mentioned things like predisposition almost to look at some things in a certain way, whether it's monkeypox or new virus X, or even if polio was found somewhere, whatever that story really represents. As we, and the human project's always got risk in it, right? But as we go through the next phase of life, in whatever we want to call this period post what's just happened to us, I'm wondering, firstly, how you see where we are now. I mean, in terms of how the public feel and see. I mean, one example I'll give is, I was in New York when we found out that the mandate was going to finish here in the UK. And I was cheering, and it was snowing in New York, and I was running down the path. There's hardly anyone there. There was a woman walking towards me, young woman. She had a mask on outside. And as she saw me coming and talking cheering and saying on the phone, she jumped out of the path into the snow. Because she was frightened that somehow outside she had but I didn't have my mask, and I'm sort of speaking elatedly into the phone. And that sense of fear of one another and concern and being at risk, which many have pointed to had happened before, the notion that we're all vulnerable to the world and at risk from things. And that had been a thing before, but really it's far more and on steroids now. How do you see where we are now in terms of just being able to assess and evaluate problems and dealing with them rationally and calmly or not? How do you see this current moment?
I suppose there's quite a few different angles I could pick up on there. You mentioned polio. So polio has been discovered in sewage in this country. We don't know that a single person in this country even has polio. No idea. They probably don't. But it's in the sewage. But there's been quite a lot of articles about it. So, the cynical part of me thinks, is part of the reason that we've got this worry about polio because actually they need to drive up the vaccination rates. I mean, one thing that for me felt intuitive, and we'll see whether I turn out to be right or not, I warned about it in one chapter in the book, is that all the incentives and the coercions around the vaccine passport, not least the idea of jabs for jobs and, mandates and a COVID pass to allow you to access normal civic society, would be bad for trust in vaccines. Now, I think of myself as rational, and I try to challenge all my confirmation biases. I really do. And I do not want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I don't trust public health advice like I used to. I would now want to read all the small print and do my own research. I wouldn't just accept something as given anymore. So, maybe polio vaccinations are down. And so maybe, I've got no idea, maybe part of this slight little bit of fear mongering is to drive the rates up. I'd argue that the best way to do that is consistently by presenting rational, fact-based information in the proper channels, and don't use any incentives and coercion. I think that my particular interest is how the government deployed behavioural science and what happens with that going forward. I think we're at a really interesting stage, a really interesting plot twist, where the public are very happy to accept nudge and even propaganda. I'm going to give you an unrelated example that illustrates this. So during the Ukraine war, near the beginning, there was a figure called the Ghost of Kiev, and also the 13 signal guards of Snake Island. Now, when these names first came out, I thought, hang on a minute, this sounds a little bit made up. This sounds a bit confected. The Ghost of Kiev could be the mythic figure from a dark fairy tale. Doesn't sound very real. And then you read about the exploits. You're like, oh, okay, so he shot down more planes than anyone's ever shot down ever. I'm definitely not buying it. But saying something like that at the time would have felt unthinkable, okay? Because this is a time when on social media, everything's been painted yellow and blue. Don't say any of it's propaganda, Laura. Don't say that. But you see, during the war, the Ukrainian authorities themselves have admitted he's made up. Okay. Now, there's actually a history of using supernatural figures to emblemize the fighting spirit of a nation. It's wartime propaganda. But to do it and admit he's made up in the space of the single war is quite I think this is unprecedented. And the sorts of people who normally would decry disinformation have said nothing. In fact, so I thought, well, let's go and see what the BBC said about this, because they've got their disinformation unit and everything. And there was a BBC News article about how it's really important to have legends in the area of social media. And so you do get this kind of really, double standard approach to what is effectively misinformation, because it's not true. And this isn't me commenting on whether you should make up the ghost of Kiev or not. What I'm saying is I think we've reached a plot twist moment. And perhaps it's because we're all on social media. We're all our own propagandists. I put a filter on my photos. We all present, not always, sometimes. Sometimes the light's naturally good. And we're all presenting the best version of ourselves online. Perhaps our tolerance for propaganda is completely different to where it used to be. So I worry about what will happen next time. I see behavioural science being used to herd people towards approving of net zero goals. There's a big study that was done among, I think it's 10,000 young people globally, to show how frightened they are about climate change. And that's being used to encourage political leaders to follow net zero goals, because they have a responsibility to prevent young people's declining mental health because of their fears about climate change, and saying that if political leaders don't pursue net zero goals, then they will be guilty of moral injury. Moral injury is a term we normally use for veterans who've come back from war and killed people, or seen terrible things like that happen. This study, when you look at it, only really asks young people to agree with catastrophic statements, things like the future of humanity is doomed. That's one example. They're not asked to agree with anything positive. They're not asked to agree with anything neutral. It's simply asking to agree on a sliding scale with extremely profoundly depressing views of humanity. And you will see this research popping up everywhere. The Nudge Unit's using it. It's been in the media. So some research is designed in order to produce a specific result, to say that young people are frightened. So it's a new way of using fears. Then that's being used to basically morally force political leaders to capitulate to a certain agenda. And if they don't, they're guilty of moral injury. But it doesn't start with any kind of grassroots idea that children are actually very scared about climate change. And if they weren't at the beginning of the survey, they would have been by the end. So that's what I'm a bit worried about, how people's emotions are being manipulated in order to create behaviour change.
I mean, you mentioned social media. One of the things that has become clear to many people in the last 28 months is how much, if you say something, it might be banned, shadow banned, censored, pulled down, taken down. Now we've got a situation where there's the online safety bill that's going through stages in Parliament, both houses, as well as things like the policing bill around demonstrations and protests where people may well have to wear tags and similar to ASBOs, but there'll be prevention orders. How much do you think, I mean, it's one of the big questions, right? I mean, because now social media is a bit like the public square. And the online safety bill, that the ability to engage and discuss, maybe to counter some of these questions that come up, that's been an arena where some people could do it, even if they have been impacted or smeared. Or are you concerned about some of these new things that are coming down the pipeline, like the online safety bill and like the policing bill, some of these things, from what you've seen in the last couple of years? I mean, how do you see them?
I think the online safety bill is awful. I mean, everyone's described it as a census charter. I don't even really need to add to it. It does a few things that are absolutely terrible. First of all, it would make something disallowable online, which is legal in real life. The idea that I could say something to you here might be really offensive, I might be really horrible to you, but it would be allowed. But can't say the same thing online is a nonsense. And it will put even more pressure on big tech companies to suppress content that could be deemed to be harmful. I think the protection from harm is quite a danger to us. You know, how do I put this? because it can sound quite cavalier. Obviously, you don't want people to be harmed in any way, including by words. But protecting us from that at all costs is potentially dangerous for freedom of speech and for open and public discourse. The thing is, I think we're actually already in a terrible mess right now online before the online safety bill. And that's because the big tech companies are already disallowing speech online that would be allowed offline. And the big tech companies now are almost as powerful as nation states. So I've been quite hopeful about Elon Musk taking over Twitter, not because I think he's a saint, not because I want to worship at the feet of some king of a big tech company, but because actually I think he'd be better than the existing governance. And whether you like it or not, the CEOs of big tech companies are a little bit like kings. And, if we're lucky, they'll be like the philosopher kings of Socrates and Aristotle, or they might not be. There's an example that someone drew my attention to just today on Twitter. There's some NHS ads encouraging young people to get vaccinated. And there's a young woman, she's in her 20s, and she's posed with her mum. And she says, I'm so grateful I had the vaccine so I could go out in my 20s and not give COVID to my mum. And you're like, well, hang on a minute, because the vaccine has never stopped you getting COVID or transmitting it. So that in itself is misinformation. Now, that's allowed by the NHS on Twitter, but if you made a claim that was counter, in the opposite direction, that wouldn't be allowed. And of course, people have lost their accounts or had posts taken down. So there are double standards when it comes to misinformation.
Absolutely. There's a few things to think about as we sort of come towards where to the future. Another thing you mentioned is vaccine passports, and we know about the mandates. And even though that they have gone, we have digital ID now in the UK. It's not mandatory, but it's being included for work and to rent places and landlords. And we know that the EU has got something for over 400 million citizens, and they've just extended it for a year. That's a deal with T-Systems and Deutsche Telekom, and that the WHO is sort of gone into contract to make that happen for 194 nations. How much do you see some of the ways things were communicated in the last couple of years impacting in all these discussions about what we do and don't do in safetyism, and when in doubt, have some regulation, or put the precautionary principle? How much do you think these things will keep playing out? And what's the antidote to that, in your opinion?
Well, I spoke to somebody for the book who told me that officials are literally skipping through the corridors of Whitehall about how far digital ID had advanced under the cover of COVID. So the thing is that all of the policies during COVID have softened people up for these future policies. That's not to suggest that I think there's some kind of nefarious plan to get everybody digitally ID'd for sinister motives. I really think that these things are multifactorial. There'll be software companies who are pushing hard for it because that's their business. There are, let's call them medical imperialists, who think we should all be vaccinated onto the eyeballs with whatever they say we should be, because that's their vision of a good society. People are often coming from understandable or legitimate viewpoints, but all kind of coalescing and pushing in one direction. I don't really have a problem with digital ID per se. It's just how it's used and what it's allied to. If you had a system of self-sovereign blockchain digital ID where you're the one in charge of it and it's completely verifiable because each little block's talking to the other block, but it would mean that I could perhaps show my driving license in one instance and they never even see my address, which is on my current plastic driving license. And of course, that should be entirely unrelated to my vaccination schedule. There can be ways to do digital ID which could be beneficial for people. But I don't suspect that's what's happening with the EU and WHO digital ID plans. I think that's about forcing people to keep up to date with state-mandated vaccination schedules.
And there was a lot of talk about the international health regulations and the amendments to that, and the World Health Organization and its position in terms of the international arena. It's only a few years ago that everyone thought the UN had completely evaporated and was of no consequence. It is interesting now that people think it is so strong, and the WHO is so strong. What's your take on what's happening with the WHO, and also their question about what will be a pandemic or not in the future, and its relationship to nation states?
I think that one obvious problem with that is that we have a couple who are from the US, and they have a very successful software company, and they're philanthropists, and they sit at the table of the WHO like states do. So considering that their business is software and vaccines, there are obviously conflicts of interest there. We can have conflicts of interests. I think some of the problems with the WHO proposed legislation is that it creates a bit of a bureaucratic monster. So in the regulations, the proposed changes to the regulations, there was nothing about lab leaks, for instance. Nothing that would make us safer from lab leaks. We're still pretending that what happened in Wuhan couldn't possibly have been a lab leak, yet it may have been. So there's a lot about pandemics and vaccinations, but nothing about lab leaks. And if you set up a bureaucracy which is designed to look for pandemics and manage them, you're probably going to find more pandemics. So things like that tend to become self-serving. Like the book Crisis and Leviathan, with every crisis, the state gets bigger, and the state in this case can mean the World Health Organization, and then finds problems to justify its existence, especially when there are corporate interests being served. But I think that some people may be overly worried about what was going on with the WHO, and that's because they've been red-pilled, and they have fears about what's happening to democracy and authoritarianism because the last couple of years they've lived through. Actually, those documents were really difficult to decipher. It was all in public health legalese, and it was quite difficult to get to the bottom of what the changes would actually be.
I saw that you had a quote in the forthcoming book by Molly Kingsley and Liz Cole, The Children's Inquiry, which interestingly and perhaps appallingly, the word children wasn't mentioned in the COVID inquiry the National Om were meant to be doing, and they made a big fuss about it. To what extent do you think that... the inquiry that they're talking about here in the UK won't be out till 2026, and now they're saying it's delayed by at least a year. And like with Grenfell and other things we've seen, when things come down the road later on, sometimes they have limited impact. How much do you think, as we approach an autumn and winter and we're going into a new set of situations where, if we to rely on the last 10 years, every year there's a crisis in the NHS of resource and everything. How much do you think some of the things that you've discovered and we've learned need to be right up front and centre now in terms of how we think about problems that are coming out, and rather than waiting for an inquiry in 6 years' time or 7 years' time, that we may, who knows what it's going to say?
Well, you're already doing work highlighting issues, and there are other organisations that do, and some journalists that are. So, there are people out there talking about these issues. I think a date has to be set for the inquiry ASAP, because then once it is, evidence is set and it's locked down. I'm quite hopeful about the inquiry. I'm determined to be hopeful. They're throwing a lot of resource and money at it. So far, the budget for the inquiry is over 190 million. And to put that into context, it was 13 for Chilcot and 5.4 for Leveson. So it's an order of magnitude different. I think there's something like 60 barristers that are going to be working on it. So, but you're quite right. The word children was never mentioned in the draft terms of reference, nor was anything to do with behavioural science and nudge, and lots of things weren't. I know that one thing they've said they will look at, for instance, is the way the pandemic affected Black and ethnic minorities differently. There's lots of angles to that. Think about the fixed penalty notices. They were disproportionately applied to Black and ethnic minority people. Don't know if that's the angle they'll be taking in the COVID inquiry, but it's important. I really, really, really hope they will look at the way the government did deploy behavioural science and propaganda to psychologically kettle the nation. If nothing else, what's the ethical framework for that? What ethical framework? There's no regulatory one, but what voluntary ethical framework was SPI-B and the Behavioural Insights team and the behavioural scientists employed at Public Health England or the NHS working to? I suspect none. And all of that should fall under the remit of the inquiry. I certainly submitted my proposal for what I think should be included in the terms of reference. So it'll be exciting to see when that is published and when they set a date.
And just going into, as we approach autumn and winter, we can't, I want to enjoy the summer like everyone does, but you kind of think, looks like there may be some problems, right? If there was a way that you could say to policymakers, but also to the public, an orientation that we could have to any issues that we face, like from a resource point of view, or because there are often challenges, right? And to not have what we've seen happen in a state of fear, what would be your core thing to say? What you say, like, look, how about we approach it like this? You know, we have challenges, but we should do it this way rather than rely on fear-based, nudge, incentive-based things. How would you approach it?
Well, fear is a depreciating asset. It's not going to work forever. You're not going to be able to scare most people about COVID anymore. I think that's run out. There are people who have COVID anxiety syndrome, or they themselves are clinically vulnerable and might have justifiable fears. And you might be able to exaggerate their fears in the autumn and the winter and say cases are increasing. I think for most people, that depreciating asset has run out. That doesn't mean they can't mint new currencies in fear. I don't know what I would say about that. I mean, I'm not really thinking about it too much. I'll be honest, the autumn and the winter, I've got my head down writing a new book, and like you're just trying to enjoy the summer. You know, one thing that I've learned is you have to enjoy the lulls when you're in them, right? You have to gather, you have to recoup, you have to have fun, because I don't want to live my life in fear. I don't want to be frightened about what horror the government or the public health bodies or the media is going to unleash on me next. I'm living my life. I'm doing my thing. I mean, in some ways, we choose our own reality all the time. That's the thing. I simply don't. I do engage with the media a lot. You know, I'm in it a lot, but I try to engage with it mindfully. I don't let it take over my brain in the same way. It's like I got a little trick. I don't even watch press conferences live. I watch them later. I don't feel as emotionally drawn in then, right? So I'm not sure what my advice to people would be, except engage with the media mindfully and, well, enjoy the summer. Just enjoy the summer for now, you know?
Well, I agree with that. And I want to say thank you very much for coming in to speak and being on Together Talks podcast. It's always really good to talk with you. I always feel like it's a refreshing moment where you can draw on previous things but think about things in the future. And I really, if for anyone that hasn't read this yet, which I'm sure many people have, but you should definitely see it. You'll be able to get it from our site, and there's a special deal for members as well, which we would like to invite anyone who's not a member to come and support us and be involved. It's how we can keep doing the campaigning and lobbying work together. But A State of Fear, you'll be able to get that as well. We're very excited about your new book, which I know it's secret, so you'll be able to at some point hopefully tell us about. But I'm looking forward to hearing and seeing from that. And thank you, Laura, for coming in, and thank you for this contribution. It's been really, really important.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you for galvanising so many people behind Together, because, you've got hundreds of thousands of members.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of people who really care about these issues. And I think it's really, you know what, it's the social conformity, okay? There's power in numbers. Everyone knows in that group that they're in a very big group of people who care about the same issues. And actually, that's how we change things. It's talking to MPs together and signing petitions, even though I don't really believe in them. But, engaging with politicians, politics and media all together. And that is how you make change. And I'm glad you list the book. I think that's brilliant. Yes. I do hear from people all the time who say that they don't consume media or feel about things the same way. Because the thing is, once you learn the techniques, it's a little bit like smoke and mirrors. It just doesn't work on you the same way. And anyone who got something out of A State of Fear will get even more out of my next book, I think. I like to think.
Well, good. We look forward to. Hopefully, you'll come back and talk to me about that when it's ready.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah.